In the remote barren region of Maine, three ladies operated what regarded to be a religious sanctuary for over 30 years. 600 ladies entered in search of religious healing, fewer than 1-2 ever back home. Individuals who did came back modified. The principal state archives contained testimony from one survivor that was so demanding. Authorities refused to make it public for over a century. This night, we reveal what virtually passed off in the back of the stone walls of the Convent of Everlasting Tears. Before we maintain with the story of the Convent of Everlasting Tears, this channel isn't for all people, handiest for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest chapters of Yankee history. If you have the courage to listen what absolutely befell in the shadows of our past, hit that subscribe button and allow us to understand within the comments what country you're listening from. Are you brave sufficient to join our network of proper mystery seekers? Let's find out collectively. What makes this tale specifically chilling is that it wasn't pushed through non-secular fanaticism or supernatural forces, however, by means of something a ways greater terrifying. The calculated pursuit of knowledge at any human fee, hidden at the back of a facade of Christian charity. Within the past due 18th century, the District of Maine became still part of Massachusetts, a wasteland territory where isolated communities struggled to live on harsh winters and even harsher realities. The coastal town of Millbridge, populous barely 300 souls, served as a buying and selling submit for lumber merchants and fishermen, brave enough to navigate the treacherous waters of the Atlantic. 15. My inland via dense wooded area marked only by local American hunting trails lay a parcel of land that could turn out to be synonymous with unspeakable horrors. The Ashford women arrived in Millbridge on a gray October morning in 1798. Their horse-drawn wagon loaded with mysterious crates and medical materials that drew curious glances from metropolis's human beings. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford stepped down from the wagon with the bearing of EU nobility, a placing female in her early 40s, with silver-streaked auburn hair and penetrating gray eyes that appeared to catalog every detail of her surroundings. Her voice carried the delicate accent of knowledgeable English society, and her manner cautioned someone aware of command and absolute obedience. Sister Prudence Ashford emerged next, a tall, gaunt female of 30, with alabaster skin and hands that moved with the perfect grace of a master craftsman. Her arms had been long and light, with an uncommon balance that could later show vital to her gruesome paintings. Not like her superior, Prudence spoke little, looking at the arena through light blue eyes that revealed nothing of her mind. While she did speak, her voice held lines of a Scottish accessory, cultured, however, with an underlying coldness that made even hardened frontiersmen uncomfortable. The youngest of the trio, novice Temperance Ashford, seemed to be barely past 22 years. She possessed a haunting splendor that drew instant interest. Raven black hair, porcelain skin, and darkish eyes that appeared to preserve ancient secrets and techniques. But there was something unsettling, approximately her splendor, a find that made mothers instinctively pull their youngsters nearer when she passed. Her smile in no way reached her eyes, and he or she had an unnerving habit of reading human beings as though they have been specimens in a group. The Ashford women claimed to be Anglican nuns fleeing religious persecution in England, looking to set up a brand new order in the American wilderness. They carried stunning letters of recommendation from English church officials, files that would later be revealed as masterful forgeries. Thomas may want to see the gleam of uncovered bone, and something darker under that he found out with ill horror was brain tissue. The screaming woman's eyes have been extensive with terror and pain. However, what made the scene even greater nightmarish was the clinical detachment of her tormentors. Mother advanced. Agatha stood nearby with a pocketbook, calmly recording observations as though she had been documenting a recurring clinical procedure. Amateur Temperance held extra gadgets, passing them to Sister Prudence with the practiced performance of an experienced surgical assistant. Thomas watched in frozen horror as Sister Prudence inserted the steel rod deeper into the lady's cranium. The screaming reached a crescendo that regarded to shake the very stones of the building, then suddenly cut off because the patient lost attention. The sisters endured, working with methodical precision, reputedly untroubled via the truth that their affected person became no longer responsive to their ministrations. Not able to witness anymore, Thomas fled into the night, stumbling through snowdrifts in blind panic. The photo of that basement chamber burned itself into his memory. The casual performance of the strategies, the scientific detachment of the perpetrators, and most terrifying of all, the belief that this becomes surely no longer the first time. Such horrors had befell inside the one-stone partitions. While Thomas reached Metropolis the next morning, he burst into his father's blacksmith safe, babbling about torture chambers and mind surgical treatment with such frantic intensity that his father feared the boy had suffered a mental breakdown. The elder Brewster, a sensible guy who valued network stability exceptionally else, listened with growing alarm as his son defined scenes that seemed to belong in Gothic novels in place of a respectable religious group. "Thomas," his father said carefully, "you had been looking on my own in a snowfall in the darkish, after tracking a wounded animal for hours. The mind can play horrible hints underneath such occasions. Perhaps what you noticed changed into a scientific method of some type. The sisters are known to treat diverse female ailments that require intimate intervention. But Thomas's description became too precise, too particular to be brushed off as hallucination or false impression. He ought to describe the format of the basement chamber, the unique units he had found, and maximum convincingly, the scientific manner in which the methods had been being conducted. This wasn't the random violence of madness, but something a ways extra sinister, systematic, methodical, and absolutely practiced. The elder Brewster determined to discuss with Deacon Morrison, the metropolis's most reputable citizen and unofficial moral authority. Morrison was a careful man who had built his popularity on cautious judgment and community concord. The Ashford sisters had been Virgin residents for 5 years, contributing generously to local charities and retaining best decorum in their rare public appearances. More importantly, numerous distinguished families presently had daughters and wives receiving treatment at the convent. "We must be extraordinarily careful," Deacon Morrison warned after hearing Thomas's account. "Accusations of this nature should wreck reputations and tear our community apart. These are reputable women of God, no longer common criminals. There ought to be a reasonable reason for what the boy thinks he noticed." However, the deacon turned into too accountable to disregard such critical allegations completely. He agreed to make a discreet inquiry, traveling the convent the following week, under the pretense of discussing a church fundraising occasion that might require the sisters' participation. Mom Superior Agatha acquired him in the convent's austere parlor, a carefully furnished room dominated via a huge wooden crucifix and non-secular artwork that regarded to look at traffic with judgmental eyes. Her manner was flawlessly gracious and composed, displaying no sign of hysteria or guilt as she served tea and inquired about his circle of relatives' fitness with apparent authentic challenge, whilst Deacon Morrison delicately noted that local hunters had said unusual noises coming from the convent at night. Mother Advanced Agatha's expression confirmed most effective moderate concern and expertise. "Deacon Morrison," she stated in her cultured English accessory, "we regularly conduct in-depth prayer classes for our maximum-stricken citizens during the quiet hours of nighttime. The manner of non-secular cleaning can be pretty vocal, especially for ladies who've lived lives of sin and ethical corruption." She explained that a lot of their patients arrived in states of severe religious misery possessed via demons of delight, lust, and rebellion that fought desperately against the purifying energy of Christian discipline. "A few women," she persisted with sympathetic disappointment, "have allowed evil to take such deep root in their souls that the system of extraction calls for huge effort. The sounds your hunters heard had been probable, the cries of demons being cast out through the electricity of prayer and penance. The reason turned into introduced with such sincerity and theological sophistication, the idea of religious struggle changed into acquainted to all frontier Christians, and the idea that particularly corrupted souls may require severe measures for their salvation become not unreasonable within the non-secular context of the generation." Mom Superior, Agatha then provided to show him via the top tiers of the convent, leading him through Spartan, however easy, dormitory rooms in which numerous ladies sat in silent contemplation. The citizens appeared calm and deeply absorbed in prayer or meditation, though Deacon Morrison observed they regarded surprisingly subdued, shifting with mechanical precision rather than natural human spontaneity. While he tried to make eye contact with them, they appeared to look through him instead of at him, as though their interest changed into targeted on something invisible inside the distance. When the deacon requested approximately traveling the basement degrees, Mom advanced Agatha to find that they served because the convent's in-depth religious counseling facilities for women requiring the most targeted interest. "I'm afraid it would be inappropriate for a man to witness such intimate methods," she stated with a modest smile. "Some of our treatments for feminine religious corruption require personal exam of the soul that could compromise the sufferer's dignity if observed by using male eyes." The reason appeared affordable within the social conventions of the time, and Deacon Morrison left the convent, feeling reassured that Thomas Brewster had indeed misinterpreted what he had witnessed. But something persisted to hassle him all through the trip home, a subtle wrongness that he could not quite identify, however couldn't shake from his thought. The ladies he had found seemed too quiet, too controlled, transferring with an unnatural uniformity that reminded him extra of sleepwalkers than conscious humans. And there have been a smell in the course of the building that he couldn't pretty area. Now not simply the expected scent of medicine and cleaning solutions, however something else underneath, something that reminded him uncomfortably of the battlefield hospitals he had visited at some stage in the modern battle, where the stench of blood and suffering had been so thick it regarded to coat the inner of his throat. Following Deacon Morrison's go-to, the Ashford sisters implemented additional security features that made their operations even more secretive. The loud screaming that had alerted Thomas Brewster changed by an eerie silence that some way regarded greater ominous than the preceding nocturnal disturbances. Nearby households continued sending their bothered women to the convent, and the sisters persisted accepting them with open hands and increasingly sophisticated guarantees of transformation. However, observant residents started noticing annoying patterns that cautioned something turned into basically incorrect with the treatments being administered at the back of those stone walls. Ladies who entered the convent for non-secular correction regularly emerged months later as absolutely one-of-a-kind humans, not reformed or redeemed, but somehow basically altered in ways that rejected explanation. Mary Prescott had been a spirited young lady of 19, recognized at some point of Millbridge for her brief wit, infectious laughter, and cussed independence that had scandalized her own family by refusing 3 marriage proposals from suitable younger men. Her parents, mortified with the aid of her public displays of willfulness, had sooner or later dispatched her to the convent for 6 months of religious steerage to prepare her for proper married lifestyles. Whilst Mary returned domestic, her mother and father have been initially delighted by way of the transformation, long gone turned into the rebellious daughter who had argued approximately everything from household responsibilities to non-secular doctrine. In her region changed into a docile, clean-eyed female who spoke handiest when directly addressed and never expressed personal critiques or dreams. She well known the primary marriage idea that got here her manor with mechanical compliance, showing no emotion or choice about the in-shape. But as weeks surpassed, Mary's mother and father grew more and more involved approximately their daughter's condition. She displayed no recognition of favorite foods, loved possessions, or youth pals. When proven letters she had written before her remedy, she stared at them without comprehension, as though searching at files written by a whole stranger. Most worrying of all, she showed no emotional reaction to something. Neither joy nor sorrow, pride nor ache appeared to sign up in her recognition. Dr. Hartwell, while consulted approximately Mary's circumstance, praised the sister's work as a whole achievement. The affected person has been cured of the mental defects that made her fallacious for marriage and motherhood, he declared expectantly. The rebellious spirit that brought about her own family such distress has been completely removed through proper non-secular field. However, Mary's mom noticed information that bothered her deeply. Her daughter bore uncommon scars on her scalp, partially hidden by using her hair, but visible at some point of washing and combing. The scars shaped a pattern that cautioned a few form of planned system instead of unintended injury. While puzzled approximately them, Mary showed no reminiscence of ways they had been obtained, stating clearly that she remembered nothing approximately her time at the convent, besides praying very hard to end up a higher woman. Similar variations occurred with growing frequency. Because the convent's popularity spread in the course of New England, Hannah Morse, dispatched for treatment of melancholia following the loss of life of her toddler son, lured her back home after 3 months as an unnaturally pleased woman who claimed to don't have any memory of ever having a baby. Whilst proven the toddler's clothing and toys, she displayed no reputation or emotional response, as if that complete bankruptcy of her life had been completely erased from her reminiscence. Elizabeth Thornton's case became possibly the maximum disturbing. The service provider's wife were committed to the convent for hysteria, after publicly accusing her husband of adultery and disturbing a divorce, scandalous behavior that threatened both family's social standing. While she lowered back after 4 months of remedy, she not only retracted her accusations, however insisted she had in no way made them. Extra troubling nonetheless, she seemed to don't have any reminiscence of the occasions that had caused her commitment, describing her marriage as flawlessly glad and her husband as beyond reproach. Elizabeth's bodily circumstance changed into additionally regarding. She complained of intense complications that left her bedridden for days at a time, and own family individuals noticed that she often appeared careworn approximately primary information, forgetting the names of longtime friends, turning into lost in familiar neighborhoods, and struggling with easy tasks that had once been second nature to her. Like the different reformed girls, she bore mysterious scars on her scalp and claimed no memory of ways they have been obtained. Dr. Hartwell persisted his enthusiastic endorsement of the Ashford strategies, although his very own behavior grew increasingly more erratic because the years handed. The as soon as respected doctor began drinking heavily and regularly, spoke in rambling monologues about advancing scientific technology and essential sacrifices for the greater good of humanity. His magazine entries from this era observed, after his dying display, a person wrestling together with his judgment of right and wrong, at the same time as justifying an increasing number of horrific moves. The strategies I have witnessed assignment each precept of medical ethics I used to be taught, but the outcomes are undeniable. The sisters have completed what European physicians most effective theorize approximately. Their documentation is meticulous, their methodology sound, their results consistent and reproducible. Records will judge whether or not we're pioneers advancing human information or monsters exploiting human suffering. The flow of correspondence between the convent and diverse European scientific establishments intensified dramatically for the duration of this period. Neighborhood postal people, even though sworn to confidentiality through beneficent payments, could not help but word the yea quantity of packages and letters bearing foreign addresses. The Ashford sisters had been receiving normal shipments of scientific texts, surgical gadgets, and chemical compounds, while sending out unique reports and what seemed to be preserved biological specimens. Mother advanced. Agatha started out making monthly journeys to Portland and Boston, always returning with crates of materials and device that required cautious managing. She explained to curious locals that the convent become pioneering innovative remedies for female mental issues, combining traditional religious healing with the modern advances in scientific technology. Her cultured way and obvious training made those factors appear possible to a community that valued each religious faith and clinical progress. But a few residents remained deeply suspicious of the changes they found inside the convents. Sufferers. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had gone through treatment and returned basically altered, commenced quietly questioning different households about their stories. She discovered a stressful pattern. None of the women who had obtained intensive remedy within the basement facilities should do not forget whatever approximately their time at the convent, except fragments of prayers and non-secular education. Martha's research found out every other troubling fact. Several women had certainly by no means returned from the convent at all. When families inquired about their missing daughters or better halves, the Ashford sisters claimed these ladies had experienced such profound spiritual awakening that they had chosen to stay as everlasting residents, dedicating their lives to prayer and care. However, households who asked to visit these intended citizens have been with courtesy but firmly grew to become away, advised that the ladies had taken strict vows of silence and seclusion that prohibited any contact with their former lives. The mystery deepened, while Martha learned that the convent became accepting women from increasingly remote locations. Rich families from New York, Philadelphia, or even Charleston were sending their most complex daughters to the remote Maine group, seemingly willing to pay full-size sums and journey first-rate distances for the promise of entire behavioral transformation. The costs had risen as a result. The sisters now charged up to $500 for what they termed comprehensive reformation, a system that commonly required 6 months and guaranteed everlasting elimination of all undesirable tendencies and inclinations. Because the convent entered its second decade of operation, the Ashford sisters had mounted themselves as diagnosed authorities on feminine mental disorders at some point of the clinical groups of both the United States and Europe. Their cautiously crafted recognition attracted interest from a number of the most outstanding physicians and researchers of the era. Men who had been interested in the detailed case studies and tremendous fulfillment prices documented inside the sisters' everyday correspondence with medical establishments. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical College have become certainly one of their most dedicated correspondents, keeping a normal alternate of letters that lasted for over 15 years. In his communications preserved inside the Harvard data, he expressed amazement at the sophistication in their research. "Your documentation of behavioral amendment techniques surpasses something I have encountered in current European literature. The precision with that, you correlate specific physical interventions with predictable character modifications, shows a degree of expertise that our career will no longer acquire for many years." What however, Whitmore failed to recognize was that he turned into studying medical descriptions of methods that could later be recognized as primitive sorts of lobotomy, trepidation, and systematic brain damage. The Ashford sisters had developed an advanced expertise of cranial anatomy and brain function through years of unrestricted experimentation on human subjects, collecting knowledge that legitimate researchers ought to best theorize about based totally on animal research and 6B74 S1091 Nina 648,475,971 Chizix Bezrok examinations. The sisters' research methodology was disturbingly thorough. They maintained distinct facts of every sufferer's personality trends, behavioral patterns, and psychological characteristics earlier than remedy, then documented each issue in their experimental techniques with clinical precision. Put up treatment observations, tracked modifications in memory, personality, cognitive characteristic, and conduct with the identical meticulous interest to element that characterized valid medical research. Their surgical techniques advanced notably in the course of this era. Sister Prudence had come to be remarkably skilled at what she termed centered cranial intervention, developing techniques for gaining access to particular regions of the mind through carefully calculated entry points. Her designated anatomical drawings, determined a long time later, confirmed various approaches to unique brain systems with specific measurements and angles that tested state-of-the-art information of cranial anatomy. The processes themselves have been carried out with clinical detachment that made them even extra horrifying. Sufferers have been typically sedated with laudanum or other opiates, but now not sufficient to put off attention completely. The sisters needed their topics to stay responsive so they could reveal the consequences of their interventions in real time. They would ask questions, supply commands, and observe adjustments in behavior as they manipulated one-of-a-kind brain regions with their devices. Amateur temperance had advanced into the organization's professional on what they known as mental conditioning and behavioral reconstruction. She developed elaborate protocols for enhancing the effects of surgical processes, via cautiously designed applications of praise and punishment, sensory manipulation, and psychological strain. Her techniques protected managed nutrients, sleep deprivation, temperature extremes, and social isolation, all calibrated to interrupt down existing persona structures and rebuild them in keeping with favored specs. The sisters also pioneered using diverse chemical substances to enhance their experimental effects. Via their community of scientific contacts, they received get right of entry to substances that would not be to be had to mainstream remedy for decades. They experimented with distinctive drug combos, documenting their effects on cognizance, memory, and susceptibility to psychological manipulation, with the identical systematic method they brought to their surgical work. By using 1815, the convent had processed over 400 ladies through their numerous treatment packages. The sisters maintained designated statistical data displaying fulfillment quotes that handed 90%, even though their definition of success became the complete elimination of anything persona tendencies or behaviors had triggered a sufferer's commitment to their care. Women who died at some stage in remedy have been recorded as failures, and there are bodies preserved for further observe. The scope in their operations multiplied dramatically all through this era. They started out accepting what they termed studies volunteers, normally destitute girls with no own family connections who had been supplied food, safe haven, and modest repayment in trade for taking part in experimental remedies designed to strengthen medical information of the feminine mind. These women, frequently prostitutes, vagrants, or widows, and not using a means of aid, provided the sisters with check topics for their maximum experimental procedures. The documentation from those experiments later located in hidden archives during the convent well-known shows a systematic approach to human experimentation that was each methodical and horrifying. The sisters recorded precise measurements of skull dimensions, specific descriptions of mind tissue reactions to numerous stimuli, and cautious observations of the connection between precise surgical interventions and behavioral adjustments. They also maintained big correspondence with researchers in the course of Europe and the USA, promoting their findings to medical establishments that had been unable or unwilling to behavior such studies themselves. The letters display a thriving black marketplace in human experimentation records, with the Ashford sisters serving as primary suppliers of statistics that couldn't be acquired via legitimate research methods. Dr. Hinrich Zimmermann of the College of Vienna have become considered one of their most beneficial clients, paying full-size sums for distinctive documentation of character change via surgical intervention. His letters, intercepted many years later, through government in particular, requested data about procedures for putting off precise memories, reducing emotional responsiveness, and creating what he termed compliant behavioral states in female subjects. The College of Edinburgh, mockingly the equal organization that had expelled Dr. Agatha Brennan years in advance, unknowingly purchased studies information from their former colleague through intermediaries who didn't display the genuine source of the information. The university's medical faculty included the Ashford findings into their curriculum, teaching surgical strategies and mental theories that were based totally on systematic human experimentation carried out in the major wilderness. Perhaps maximum chilling of all, the sisters began accepting commissions for particular styles of behavioral change. Wealthy families ought to request particular character modifications of their problematic household, disposing of artistic interests, reducing intellectual curiosity, suppressing romantic attachments, or creating ideal domestic compliance. The sisters advanced specialized methods for every form of amendment, charging premium prices for his or her increasingly sophisticated offerings. The cautious facade that had covered the Ashford sisters for nearly many years began to reveal its first severe cracks in the wintry weather of 1818. Whilst a young girl named Sarah Whitman arrived at the convent underneath occasions that would ultimately prove to be their undoing. Unlike the broken, desperate ladies, who commonly sought the sisters' help, Sarah got here as a fighter, possessed of an intelligence and energy of will that had now not been beaten via the social pressures that commonly preceded dedication to the institution. Sarah's crime was having given delivery to a toddler out of wedlock, and steadfastly refusing to reveal the daddy's identity, no matter months of stress from her wealthy Boston circle of relatives. Her mother and father, outstanding merchants with a recognition to defend, had initially tried to set up a discreet marriage or adoption that might keep own family honor. When Sarah rejected both alternatives, insisting on her proper to preserve her infant and stay independently, they declared her mentally unstable and arranged for her commitment to the convent of eternal tears. At 24, Sarah possessed a powerful intellect that had been nurtured by means of revolutionary mother and father, till her being pregnant made her an embarrassment. She had acquired a strangely comprehensive education for a female of her technology, which include publicity to scientific texts via her father's connections with Boston physicians. This history gave her know-how that could show important to recognizing the actual nature of the Ashford sisters' sports. From the instant of her arrival, Sarah understood that the convent turned into now not what it appeared to be. The opposite citizens moved with the mechanical precision of human beings whose personalities have been basically altered, their responses unnaturally managed, and their eyes disturbingly vacant. Many bore seen scars on their scalps, partly concealed by using hair that had been allowed to grow again over surgical websites. Most telling of all, several women displayed clear signs of mind damage, trouble with speech, reminiscence troubles, and persona adjustment so dramatic they appeared like entirely distinct human beings. Sarah's scientific information allowed her to recognize these signs and symptoms for what they have been: the results of deliberate surgical intervention within the brain. At some point of her first week on the convent, she became subjected to the equal initial examinations that preceded all in-depth treatments, designated measurements of her skull, extensive questioning about her character developments and behaviors, and bodily assessments that appeared designed to map her neurological responses as opposed to examine her non-secular circumstance. The Ashford sisters had been to begin with at a loss for words, with the aid of Sarah's resistance to their fashionable conditioning techniques. Most sufferers, already damaged by using social disgrace and own family rejection, fast submitted to the convent's authority shape. Sarah, however, maintained her defiance even underneath an increasing number of harsh treatment designed to break down her mental defenses and prepare her for extra-intensive intervention. She'd become positioned in solitary confinement for days at a time, denied okay meals and water, and subjected to hours of psychological abuse designed to ruin her experience of self-worth. Sister Temperance, the convent's professional in behavioral conditioning, employed each approach in her arsenal to interrupt Sarah's will: sensory deprivation, temperature extremes, sleep disruption, and steady verbal attack on her man or woman and really worth as an individual. Through all of it, Sarah remained alert and decided to escape. She used her time in isolation to mentally map the convent's layout. More importantly, she began documenting her observations in a makeshift journal written on scraps of paper, with ink made from berry juice and hidden in the seams of her garb. Sarah's leap forward got here at some stage in a violent thunderstorm in March 1819, when flooding in the basement disrupted the convent's everyday operations. The sisters were pressured to relocate equipment and sufferers to higher floors, developing confusion that gave Sarah the opportunity she had been looking forward to. In the chaos of transferring substances and managing crisis, she slipped far from her guards and started out exploring regions of the constructing that were generally strictly forbidden to patients. What she observed in the basement chambers exceeded her worst fears. The flooded rooms contained proof of methods that confounded comprehension. Operating tables equipped with restraints designed to immobilize sufferers completely. Collections of surgical contraptions unlike whatever utilized in traditional medication. And most horrifying of all, preserved specimens of human brain tissue floating in glass jars, every carefully labeled with affected person names, dates, and procedural notes. The surgical information she observed documented methods that she diagnosed as planned brain harm inflicted with scientific precision. The notes defined the systematic removal of mind tissue from specific regions, with careful observations approximately resulting changes in character, memory, and behavior. Some entries protected distinctive sketches of open skulls and anatomical diagrams showing the precise locations of surgical intervention. Most damning of all, Sarah found extensive correspondence files containing letters from ECU physicians who had been shopping the sister study's data for sizable sums of money. The letters mentioned the purchase of experimental results and anatomical specimens with the casual indifference of business transactions. It had become clear that the convent became operating as a business organization, promoting the results of human experimentation to researchers who have been unwilling or unable to behavior such research themselves. Armed with this expertise and samples of documentation that she controlled to conceal on her individual, Sarah started making plans her breakout with desperate urgency. She knew that she'd become scheduled for extensive remedy inside days, and she or he understood that this will probably go away her as damaged as the other ladies she had found. Her window of opportunity became final hastily, and the sisters had been turning into increasingly suspicious of her persistent resistance to their conditioning methods. The getaway try came on a moonless nighttime in early April 1819, while Sarah controlled to overpower a shield and flee into the encircling wooded area. The Ashford sisters right now prepared a large search attempt, knowing that Sarah possessed information that could damage their cautiously constructed facade and exposed many years of crook activity. For 3 harrowing days, she avoided capture while making her manor through the desert closer to the nearest agreement, surviving on spring water and anything fit to be eaten flora she may want to pick out. The sisters' pursuit changed into relentless and properly prepared. They knew the terrain in detail and had the assets to mount a comprehensive manhunt that blanketed nearby men who had been hired underneath the pretense of attempting to find a mentally disturbed female who may harm herself. Sarah ought to hear her pursuers for the duration of her flight, their calls echoing through the wooded area as they systematically searched every possible hiding vicinity. On the second night of her escape, Sarah became nearly recaptured when she stumbled into a Sikh birthday party, even as searching for safe haven from an unexpected rainstorm. Simplest short thinking and intimate expertise of the woodland received at some stage in youth. Visits to her grandfather's logging camp allowed her to evade detection. She spent the remainder of the nighttime hiding in a fallen tree, taking note of her pursuers searched the place around her hiding place. Just while we thought the horrors of the Maine wilderness couldn't worsen, Sarah's determined flight through the wooded area intensifies. If this tale is supplying you with chills, percentage this video with a pal who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to aid our content material, and take into account to join by no means miss stories like this. Permits discover together what happens whilst Sarah sooner or later reaches civilization, and the surprising reality begins to unravel. With the aid of the third day, Sarah's physical situation changed into deteriorating hastily. She changed into dehydrated, exhausted, and laid low with publicity to the tough April weather. Her feet were bleeding from walking barefoot over difficult terrain, and she turned into starting to reveal signs of hypothermia. However, her willpower to reach safety and expose the Ashford sisters' crimes drove her ahead regardless of her friend's protests. The leap forward got here when she encountered a trapper named Joshua Meadows, who turned into checking his traces inside the early morning hours. Initially suspicious of this wild-looking woman rising from the forest, Joshua's mindset changed dramatically whilst Sarah began describing precise information about the convent that best someone with inner understanding should recognize. Her desperation changed into authentic. Her accidents had been real, and her story became too exact and regular to be the product of mental infection. Joshua provided Sarah with meals, warm clothing, and most significantly, secure passage to the sheriff's office in Millbridge. However, even as they traveled collectively, Sarah remained terrified that the Ashford sisters could find her earlier than she could tell her tale to government. She had seen sufficient of their operations to recognize that they'd resources and connections that prolonged a ways past their remoted convent. While Sarah Whitman eventually reached Sheriff William Hawthorne's workplace in Millbridge on April 18, 1819, her appearance and wild claims first of all met with the same skepticism that had greeted Thomas Brewster's account 16 years earlier. Sheriff Hawthorne, a realistic man who prided himself on level-headed judgment, assumed he turned into confronting some other sufferer of barren region exposure and intellectual breakdown. Sarah's tale of systematic human experimentation seemed too great to be credible, too terrible to be actual. However, several factors distinguished Sarah's testimony from common bills of disturbed people. First, her unique know-how of the convent's interior format matched statistics that had by no means been made public. She should describe now not best the overall shape of the constructing, but particular information about the basement chambers, the association of equipment, and the places of hidden storage regions that only someone with large inside get right of entry to should recognize. More importantly, Sarah had managed to steal numerous vital documents for the duration of her escape. Surgical notes, correspondence with EU scientific institutions, and patient information that furnished concrete proof of the Ashford sisters' activities. These documents written in medical language, however, describing procedures that could be taken into consideration, conflict crimes by way of present-day requirements, left no doubt approximately the systematic nature of the horrors being performed on the convent. The first report turned into a surgical log, protecting processes performed on 23 one-of-a-kind girls over the route of 8 months. The entries were written with medical precision, documenting operations that concerned drilling holes in sufferers' skulls and inserting diverse implements to harm or put off precise mind tissues. Each access blanketed distinctive preoperative persona checks, surgical notes describing the exact techniques performed, and publish operative observations, monitoring changes in behavior, memory, and cognitive characteristics. One especially chilling entry described the case of Margaret Fowler, a 19-year antique woman who had been devoted for excessive analyzing and intellectual curiosity inappropriate to her intercourse. The surgical notes documented a process designed to harm the mind areas associated with getting to know and reminiscence with the stated goal of reducing sufferers' compulsive interest in books and abstract questioning at the same time as retaining basic domestic abilities. The published operative observations confirmed the horrific success of the system. Margaret's personality were essentially altered. Her love of reading became absolutely removed. Her vocabulary became dramatically decreased and her ability to interact in complex reasoning became severely impaired. The notes concluded with pride that patient now presentations, suitable feminine docility, and shows no hobby in activities beyond primary household responsibilities. The second one file was even extra damp, an in-depth correspondence record containing letters from Dr. Hinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna, negotiating the acquisition of cranial intervention studies, information for the sum of 40 Austrian florins. The letters in particular asked documentation of techniques for eliminating undesired recollections and character trends through surgical amendment of mind shape. Dr. Zimmermann's correspondence discovered the life of a worldwide network of researchers who have been shopping human experimentation information from the Ashford sisters. Universities in Edinburgh, Berlin, and Paris were all receiving everyday reports detailing the consequences of approaches that would be banned underneath any civilized prison device. The sisters have been essentially working as business suppliers of facts that legitimate researchers couldn't reap via ethical means. The 0.33 record turned into perhaps the maximum frightening. A affected person catalog list over 600 girls who were processed through the convent's diverse packages for the reason that 1798. The catalog become organized by means of kind of treatment acquired with detailed annotations describing the specific strategies accomplished on every affected person in their closing disposition. Most of the people of entries were marked reformed. And again, girls who had gone through surgical change and been dispatched back to their families with altered personality. A smaller wide variety have been indexed as permanent citizens, ladies who had supposedly chosen to stay on the convent, but whose modern-day whereabouts have been unspecified. Most troubling of all, nearly 200 entries were marked honestly as expired. women who had died at some stage in or rapidly after experimental processes. Sheriff Hawthorne, faced with this overwhelming evidence, found out he'd become coping with crimes that exceeded anything in his enjoy. He at once organized a raid on the convent, assembling a force of 15 armed guys for what he now understood could be a ways extra than a recurring arrest. The sheriff also sent pressing messages to authorities in Portland and Boston, inquiring for help from federal marshals who would have jurisdiction over crimes of this significance. But the Ashford sisters had been monitoring the state of affairs through their network of informants in Millbridge. By the time the raiding party reached the convent, at the morning of May 20th, 1819, they determined the building absolutely deserted. The sisters had vanished during the night, taking with them most of their transportable equipment and documentation, leaving behind only the proof they couldn't transport. The hunt of the abandoned convent found out a chamber of horrors that traumatized even the most hardened individuals of the raiding birthday celebration. The basement contained a completely prepared surgical theater with implements particularly designed for cranial strategies. The walls had been covered with shelves, preserving hundreds of preserved brain specimens, every labeled with exact data about the affected person from whom it had been eliminated and the unique experiments that were performed. A hidden chamber at the back of a false wall contained 47, our bodies in diverse states of upkeep, all displaying proof of cranial surgical operation. The bodies had been maintained in a solution of alcohol and other chemicals, seemingly for ongoing have-a-look-at purposes. Each corpse was tagged with exact statistics about the strategies that have been accomplished and the outcomes that were performed earlier than loss of life. The investigators also discovered widespread documentation that had been left behind in the sisters' hasty departure. File shelves contained lots of pages of surgical notes, patient statistics, and correspondence with clinical institutions at some stage in the arena. The scope of the operation becomes superb. The sisters were carrying out systematic human experimentation for over 20 years, documenting techniques that would not be recognized by way of mainstream medication for many years. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, whilst confronted with proof of his complicity within the operation, first of all tried to justify his involvement through claiming he become advancing medical technology for the gain of humanity. Those women were already misplaced to society, he argued desperately. Their situations made them incorrect for ordinary life. At the least, their suffering contributed to expertise so that it will help future generations. However, whilst supplied with the full scope of the experimentation and the evidence of systematic homicide disguised as clinical treatment, Dr. Hartwell suffered what regarded to be a whole intellectual breakdown. In his final confession, brought at the same time as beneath defend in the Millbridge prison, he found out the true identities of the Ashford sisters and the whole volume in their criminal background. The ladies known as Mother Superior Agatha, Sister Prudence, and Novice Temperance Ashford had been truly Dr. Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashford, and Dr. The Temperance Ashford educated physicians who have been expelled from EU medical establishments for engaging in unauthorized human experiments. Dr. Brennan had been banned from training medicinal drug in Scotland after numerous sufferers died during her experimental strategies designed to accurate feminine hysteria through surgical intervention. Prudence Ashford had been brushed off from the University of Edinburgh clinical faculty. After being caught undertaking illegal experiments on asylum, patients attempting to map brain characteristic via systematic harm to specific cranial regions. Dr. Temperance Ashford, the youngest of the three, have been her sister's pupil in growing mental conditioning strategies designed to enhance the results of surgical techniques. The three girls had fled Europe in 1797 and hooked up their false identity as Anglican nuns to offer cover for continuing their studies in an area wherein they would be free from clinical oversight or legal constraints. That they had spent over 20 years perfecting strategies for enhancing human behavior through surgical intervention, collecting expertise that legitimate researchers could most effective dream of acquiring. The manhunt for the escaped Ashford sisters became one of the maximum massive criminal investigations in early American records, involving federal marshals, nearby sheriffs, and even global cooperation with ECU authorities. But the three ladies had vanished absolutely, leaving at the back of simplest the bad evidence of their decades of systematic human experimentation. Research discovered that the sisters had maintained more than one escape routes from the convent, and had amassed considerable wealth from their illegal sports. Bank records found for the duration of the research showed they had transferred sizable sums to debts in Canada, Mexico, and numerous European nations over time. The entire amount exceeded $50,000, a fortune that could be well worth thousands and thousands in state-of-the-art foreign money. The sisters had additionally installed false identities and secure homes at some stage in North America and Europe, suggesting they had planned their eventual escape from the start of their American operations. Delivery information indicated they had been regularly moving device and documentation out of the convent for months earlier than Sarah's escape, preparing for the possibility that their sports would sooner or later be located. The investigation discovered the entire scope in their crook corporation. Over the path of 21 years, the Ashford sisters had processed greater than 600 women through their experimental applications. Of these, approximately 250 had been lowered back to their families as correctly treated sufferers, even though research found out that everyone showed symptoms of mind damage consistent with surgical intervention. Every other 50 ladies have been suggested as deciding on to stay at the convent as everlasting citizens, though no trace of these ladies became ever observed. The sisters had seemingly murdered these sufferers while their situations made them wrong. For go back to society, retaining their bodies for ongoing have a look at and disposing of the remains when protection become not useful. The closing 200 girls had been located in various states of upkeep throughout the convent's hidden chambers. Those regarded to be sufferers who had died for the duration of experimental methods or were deliberately killed whilst their responses to remedy provided treasured studies facts. The systematic renovation of those bodies advised they had been maintained for comparative study over extended intervals. The research additionally exposed evidence of an in-depth community of collaborators in the course of the medical and educational communities. Dr. Hartwell became most effective one in all numerous physicians who had referred patients to the convent and furnished clinical supplies in exchange for access to experimental consequences. Postal people, suppliers, or even a few nearby officers were paid to preserve secrecy. Approximately the convent sports. Universities during the USA and Europe had been discovered to have unknowingly incorporated the Ashford sisters' studies into their scientific curricula. Surgical techniques and mental theories that had been being taught to new generations of physicians have been primarily based on systematic human experimentation performed within the main desolate tract. The discovery compelled a painful re-exam of the resources of clinical information and the ethical standards of the profession. The households of sufferers confronted an agonizing preference among looking for justice and shielding their reputations. Public acknowledgement that their daughters and other halves have been subjected to awful experimentation could expose them to social scandal and spoil their standing of their communities. Maximum selected silence, preferring to live with personal grief as opposed to public shame. This conspiracy of silence supposed that the total quantity of the Ashford sisters' crimes became by no means officially mentioned. The investigation was quietly closed after 6 months, with maximum of the proof sealed in government documents that would not be opened for over a century. The legitimate file, without a doubt, said that 3 girls running a fraudulent medical facility had fled justice, leaving in the back of evidence of irregular remedy method. The convent building changed into finally burned to the floor by local citizens, who desired to erase all hint of what had occurred there. However, the large documentation of the sisters' experiments became preserved and ultimately made its manner to medical establishments all through the world. Satirically, studies that had been received via such bad manner contributed to legitimate advances in knowledge-mind characteristic and psychological issues. Sarah Whitman, the sole survivor to get away and reveal the truth, struggled for years with the trauma of her revel in. She spent months supplying testimony to investigators and supporting to pick out different sufferers, but the emotional toll became devastating. The knowledge that she was the most effective individual inclined to speak publicly. Approximately the horrors she had witnessed isolated her from a society that desired to forget such uncomfortable truths. Sarah in the end moved to California below an assumed call, in which she worked as an instructor whilst trying to rebuild her lifestyles. She in no way married and maintained minimal touch with her circle of relatives who were embarrassed by using her public testimony about the convent. Her unique memoir, written quickly before her death in 1863, provided the maximum entire account of existence in the convent of Eternal Tears and served as essential historic evidence of the sisters' crimes. The Ashford sisters themselves were by no means captured, although unconfirmed reviews located them in various locations at some stage in the Americas and Europe over the following many years. Some investigators believe they endured their work underneath exclusive identities. At the same time as others counseled, they were killed by way of pals in search of to take away witnesses to their crimes. A pronounced sighting in Argentina in 1847 defined 3 elderly ladies working a non-public scientific facility for wealthy families. However, research proved inconclusive. The most credible account came from a French medical doctor who claimed to have encountered Dr. Agatha Brennan in Paris in 1856. In step with his report, she turned into working below an assumed call as a private medical doctor, specializing in anxious disorders in ladies, the usage of techniques that bore suspicious similarities to the methods documented at the principal convent. But, whilst authorities investigated, the woman had already disappeared, leaving in the back of only tantalizing tips of her true identification. The case of the Convent of Eternal Tears represents one of the most systematic and extended examples of human experimentation in American records.